Hello, I'm Rick Harp. Welcome to this special anniversary commemoration of APTN and APTN National News. And it was 20 years ago today, in 1999, when APTN began broadcasting. And over the course of this look back at our double-decade history, we'll share some of the early stories that made us what we are today and see some of the people who made those stories possible. People like Dan David, the first ever director of the department, back when the then weekly newscast was called In Vision News. A proud member of the Mohawk community of Gunnesadage, that's where we recently sat down together to reflect on how we ended up at APTN and why Indigenous journalism still matters.
My name is Dan David, and my Mohawk name is Tyre Denote, and I'm a writer, a freelance journalist, and a media trainer. Well, this is smack in the middle of Gunnesadage territory. It's kind of like a checkerboard square territory. You know, we've got pieces of land here and there. This is smack in the middle of the largest piece, basically called the Bay. It's also called the Lake of Two Mountains because we have a mountain over here and there's another mountain on the other side of the lake. So it's a Lake of Two Mountains.
When did you first realize you wanted to tell stories for a living?
Well, that was in high school, actually. I wanted to go to Carleton journalism, but I was streamed away by Indian Affairs. They thought, you know, like most people at that time, that I'd make a good carpenter or auto mechanic or bricklayer. Women were pushed into homemaking and other kinds of things, dressmaking, for instance. But I always wanted to be a writer. I always wanted to be a journalist. Ever since I picked up a newspaper, it was in high school where they would bring in the Montreal Star and the Montreal Gazette, and we would have our current affairs class. And I just loved it, the idea. And at some point, I thought I could do better than that. I could do better than them when I read some of the stories.
What do you consider to be your very first piece of journalism?
That's a good question. I think it was for CBC Radio. It was when I got sent up to Whitehorse. Before that, it was just basically recording people's statements, but actually doing what I think is journalism, which is looking at the why of things, not just the who, the what, the when, but why things were happening. And I think it was for a story I did on land claims for Our Native Land, CBC Radio program. But I was working at CBC Radio up in Whitehorse at the time.
For some reason, the expression "you never forget your first time" it's in my. Was there a sense of that, having completed that trip?
Because I worked. I got up at something like 4 o'clock in the morning, so I could make the, get the 5:30 newscast ready, and then I worked all day up until about midnight doing this story for Our Native Land. I went home. I mean, I was dead tired. And I listened to it the next day because Our Native Land aired on Saturday. And I was just blown away. Oh my God, that's me on network radio.
So before APTN, I could only dream of an all-Indigenous newsroom. And I'm wondering what it was like for you to work in places like CBC and TVO and be most likely one of the very few, if the only Indigenous person in that space.
It was lonely. Yeah, there was you were always judged slightly deficient, not good enough because you were a token hire, because you were, an employment equity person, hired because of the color of your skin, not your skills or experience. So you had to prove yourself, and you had to work twice as hard. That's the cliche, but it's also very true. You had to work twice as hard and work twice as long to be accepted as a journalist.
Was there ever the infamous quota, "Thank you, we have enough Indigenous stories this month"?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that happened all the time. In a place like Regina, Saskatchewan, of course, they're all looking at stories that are going to mean something to their audience, and we weren't part of that audience. Our people were north of the tracks in Regina, and so everybody else, farmers out in, Melfort, Saskatchewan, they were part of our audience, but not people over at Cody Reserve out near Manitoba or even Capel Valley. No, they just weren't part of our audience. And I asked once, I went around and asked a whole bunch of people in various newsrooms why we did so badly covering Native issues. And they said, well, one person was really quite honest about it, says, because they don't buy advertising. If they don't buy advertising, then why should we cover them? newspapers, radio, television, CTV, CBC, Global, it didn't matter.
That was their public.
That was their public, that was their target audience. We weren't part of it.
When and how did you first hear about this opportunity to run the APTN newsroom?
Well, I came back from South Africa working down there. I had gone off and on over the years from '93 before the elections in South Africa, very first elections. And then I wind up back here, and I'm basically penniless, homeless, jobless, and I got nothing to do. But I saw an ad for APTN, and I didn't think, you know, I'm not worthy. But a friend of mine said, apply anyway. What do you got to lose? So I did, and surprise, surprise, I got called in for an interview, and it shocked the hell out of me that I got the job.
Why?
Because when I went in for the job interview, I had this idea after working abroad that that's exactly what we needed as Indigenous people, a national television news network with reporters and producers out there who are doing real, original Indigenous journalism, not just journalism with, you know, an Indigenous face on it, but real Indigenous journalism, getting into who we are, telling stories about what we stand for, what our values are, why we think the way we do.
At the core of journalism is accountability, but I've noticed of late kind of a resurgence in this idea that Indigenous media are airing the dirty laundry and doing a disservice to our communities rather than helping them. What do you make of that pushback? How do you respond?
It's always been there. Anybody who was worth their salt as an Indigenous journalist tried to do those kinds of accountability stories, and they got that kind of pushback. We've always had that problem. And, you know, as a journalist, you either, you know, do the stories that you think that you have to do, which is tell the truth about, you know, corruption, about abuse of power, about sexual harassment, or, you know, you don't. And you simply become a cheerleader for those people, and you aid in the cover-up of that. And I think that most Indigenous journalists would prefer to tell the truth to their people and not lie for them.
I guess you don't buy the argument that it could do more harm than good?
No, I don't. I think that you air the dirty laundry because it needs to be aired. It needs to be sent to the cleaners. Otherwise, nothing ever changes. It's a hell of an opportunity for any kind of Indigenous journalist to work at something like APTN, the very first Indigenous national television network in the world, and to work at something like this and carry on a tradition of doing good journalism, damn good journalism, without fear or favor. Remember, we weren't supposed to succeed. We were supposed to fail.
Well, we're not supposed to survive, period. We're not supposed to be here.
Exactly. But as APTN, you know, it wasn't supposed to exist. It humbles you to think that you actually took part in building something like this.
And here with me now in our Winnipeg studio, a still humble Dan David. Welcome back to APTN National News.
I'm honored.
This set's just a little bit more elaborate than our first one, eh?
It's really shiny.
Yes, it's
compared
true.
to the ones we had.
I'm looking for Jean-Luc Picard or, you know, or William Shatner. But yeah, remember that? I mean, that set was in maybe a quarter of the space that we have now.
At least it could probably fit into this little area.
That's true. That's true. And so over the course of this hour, you're going to help us take a trip down memory lane, correct?
I'll try.
Okay, you'll do your best. So why don't we start with a quirky little bit of tape, literally tape, not the digital stuff we use now, little different. Shot by then video journalist David Moses, he's trying to capture how some forestry workers, upset over an Algonquin anti-logging blockade, well, they decided to stage a counter-blockade, shutting off the community's food and medicine supply. Take a look.
A few weeks ago, we told you the story of Cookhamville, Quebec, about 2 hours north of Ottawa. The Algonquin people there blocked a road to keep loggers out. Now, loggers are antagonizing the Algonquin people. They're also endangering their lives. They've blocked the only road into the community, cutting off food and medicine. Police are just sitting by, doing nothing. No one is getting in or out. Envision's David Moses found out firsthand.
C'est ta carte de presse. Bon, ta carte de presse. C'est quoi? C'est quoi tu fais? C'est quoi tu filmes pour qui?
C'est APTN.
C'est quoi ça? C'est quoi ça? Non, non, attends là. As-tu ta carte de presse? As-tu ta carte de presse? You have a card for working?
Sorry?
You have a card for working?
In the front video.
Come in. Go to. Go. Est-ce qu'on veut... Non, on veut pas. Where is your f***ing card?
So Dan, that's kind of a humorous story. These three people and the cameraman trying to work all this stuff out, so to speak. But it's also very tense too.
It was very serious.
What are your thoughts about that whole? Yeah.
Well, it was one of the things. I mean, an entire community was blockaded. I've experienced that, and having your food and any other kind, not being able to get to work, your jobs are endangered. You're losing pay. You're not able to feed your families. And whatever kind of food medicine is being blocked by these counter-protesters. So that was really strange and bizarre, especially when they were protesting logging that was clear-cutting within their hunting territories.
And something to note here, maybe a little technological, but I mean, basically one person had been sent out. So you can see reflected in the truck door there, David Moses acting as both camera person and reporter.
And translator.
Translator, that's right. And so we definitely have lots more stories to reminisce about, including a high seas battle over fishing rights and some harrowing footage of youth solvent abuse. Dan will walk us through all of it down memory lane. Please stay with us. Our APTN News retrospective continues after these messages. And welcome back to this special 20-year retrospective on APTN National News on the anniversary of APTN, the network. In studio with me now, throughout the hour, is the first ever director of news, Dan David. And Dan, you're helping us to kind of look back at some of the more memorable stories of yesteryear. And one of the biggest I recall is Burnt Church, which was, in essence, a battle over Indigenous fishing rights. And I'd like you to kind of set the stage for us, both in terms of the broader stakes of the story, but also in terms of the challenges we face just trying to tell that story.
Well, it's out in New Brunswick. It's down by the coast, of course, because there's fishers. And it's a story about resource development. In this case, it was a fishery. And our rights were being undermined. And people were going out on the water, things that they had done traditionally since forever. But here we had government officials coming out and arresting people for doing what they had been doing all along, and stuff that was guaranteed to them by treaty. And it was an erosion, an official erosion of our Indigenous rights. And so this was part of a larger story, a national story, but it was locally based. And what caught our attention was the level of violence being exacted upon Indigenous people by government authorities. In this case, it was Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
And we had dozens of reporters on the scene, right?
No. No, we didn't. As big a story as it was, we couldn't afford to send everybody. But eventually, we did send out a truck and did a live remote. And it was the first time that we did something like that. It caught the attention of other networks, and that was the important part, I think, that we could actually use the network as a megaphone and start to get our voices heard over an important story that was just as valid up north as it was out in BC or on the Atlantic coast.
We did what we could with what we had, and it resonated. All right, let's take a look at that story.
Tensions between Mi'kmaq fishers and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans continued this week. Early Wednesday morning, DFO officers began pulling up almost 1,300 lobster traps from the waters near Burnt Church, New Brunswick. Burnt Church fishers raced out onto the water to stop them. The confrontation ended with 2 fishers and 1 officer being injured. RCMP are investigating possible charges against both the fishers and the fisheries officers. Envision's Greg Taylor has more.
An early morning raid turns violent as Department of Fisheries and Oceans officers try to seize Micmac lobster traps. This amateur video, taken of the Wednesday raid, shows DFO officers ramming and sinking a Micmac boat, sending 3 men diving for the water. Burnt Church Chief Wilbur Denham says the officers went too far and they should be charged with attempted murder. But DFO Minister Herb Dhaliwal says the officers were just enforcing the law.
We take every precaution to make sure that people aren't hurt. But the fisheries officers have a job to do out there. They have to remove traps that are illegal or unauthorized. And they'll continue to do that. Those instructions that go to them are from me and from the department.
National leader Matthew Kuncum was unflinching in his support of Burnt Church. His message to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, Herb Dhaliwal, to back off. Later he spoke in depth with Envision News.
I guess, why are you here?
Well, I'm here to support Burnt Church First Nation. I am here to relay the message that this is an unfinished business. That we as First Nations and the Canadian government will have to deal with the sharing the wealth of the land. Because the Royal Commission made it very clear that we need to look at the major redistribution of lands and resources in order to fight the poverty and the high unemployment rate of our communities. Because when you look right across Canada, whether it be with the trees, whether it be with oil, whether it be with gas, or even with hydro and fisheries here, that we are not benefiting. That there's an economic disparity here, there's unfair, it's unacceptable, that the First Nations people are the first inhabitants of this country. We're not allowed to share a resource that's right in their own backyard here. And to see these other people taking that resource, and then they're able only expected to rely on government handouts. And that has not worked because there's a 90% of unemployment here in Burnt Church.
Well, Dan, thank goodness all these fights over fisheries are over and well behind us.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, I was struck by a number of things, from the small to the, well, actually not necessarily small. I mean, those are the days we still used to say Micmac instead of Mi'kmaq, right? More of the pronunciation of the people there. I was struck by the fact that a national chief went on site, showed up there, they're kind of right in the heart of the flashpoint. We don't see that much these days, anyway, of a national chief doing that. And also the integration of video made by somebody there on the scene, a non-journalist, kind of predicting, if you will, or anticipating the use of things like YouTube and cell phone videos and stuff. So it's a whole interesting mix there. How about you? What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts were, at the time, this is a hell of a story. And we got on it as fast as we could because we understood the significance of the story. And that's why the national chief was there. Because without APTN telling that story, I don't think that he would have shown up. Because we're telling a story that very few reporters were covering. It was an Atlantic story, and that always gets obscured or ignored for the rest of Canada. And so when we sent out reporters actually on the boats, in the fishing, doing the lobster fishing, it sent a signal to every other network, and suddenly they started showing up in the lineups early in the morning and actually sending out their cameras as well. So it was, we were there first, and we drew attention to an important story, and everybody else followed. Yeah, and I mean that, again, that wouldn't be the first time, wouldn't be the last time that we do that, sort of set the agenda, if you will, for other media. Some stories we owned from top to bottom. All right, well, let's go to another story now, and kind of a real heartbreaker, to be honest. This is the story of sniffing among Indigenous youth.
It's been more than a year since images of Innu children sniffing gasoline fumes made headlines in Canada. Leaders pleaded with the federal and Newfoundland governments to intervene. The children were apprehended and placed in treatment centres across Canada. Envision's Maureen Gugu revisited Labrador to see how the Innu children are doing. She sends this report.
This was a scene in Shashi last year. Innu children sniffing gas fumes in broad daylight. This is what Shashi is like this year. No one walking around with garbage bags filled with gasoline. More than 30 children were taken away from here in Davis Inlet. They were shipped out for addiction treatment. Some are still here at this youth treatment center in Shashi. We can't show their faces because they are minors, but most of them are from Davis Inlet, or Mushwa. It means people of the Barrens. It's an isolated community in northern Labrador. You can only get here by plane. In the daytime, children play, but at night, the ones who sniff gas come out. This teen's name is Thomas. He was sent to Alberta for treatment, but he was back to sniffing 2 months after he returned home. He says he sniffs when he gets angry, but he doesn't want to talk about that.
Get mad.
Get mad?
Yeah.
Oh.
Start sniffing.
Why do you get mad?
We want to know.
Just
It's your business.
okay. That's okay.
It's all right.
That's fine.
But this health worker in Davis Inlet knows why.
Some of them have returned to their homes. Nothing has changed. There's people still drinking. Most of them who went into a treatment, the parents have relapsed. And I don't feel like anything has changed for them.
And in Shanxi, it's the same story. Some of the kids continue to suffer. This addictions counselor says you have to look really hard at night to find these children sniffing gas.
There are still some kids who are maybe occasionally gas sniff in the evenings or whenever. I haven't seen them myself, but other people come and say, well, so-and-so is gas sniffing again. And our fear was that the ones who may be addicted to gas sniffing would introduce to the younger ones, and that was our fear.
Both communities have some aftercare programs for the children and their families, but more needs to be done. That means more money from the federal and provincial governments for anger management, for parenting skills, so families can break the cycle of solvent and alcohol addictions for good. In nearby Goose Bay, young Aboriginal people here say Innu and Inuit children need more to do as well. Growing up in isolated communities leaves these children cut off from activities that other children take for granted.
I did things upon myself, like me and my friends would play a lot of sports and do other things like that within the community, but these children don't have the the resources to do the things that we could do, right?
The cold weather has set in now in Davis Inlet and Shanxi, so not too many children are sniffing gas out in the open. The local addictions counselors hope they see fewer and fewer children walking around with gas-filled garbage bags when the weather warms up this spring. Maureen Gugu, Envision News, Shanxi, Labrador.
All right, Dan David, what are your thoughts watching that particular story?
It's a tough story. It's about kids, and it's about something that we really don't like to talk about, which is, addictions. We don't like to talk about that, whether it's alcohol or it's glue sniffing or gasoline sniffing.
Talk about or much less actually show.
Exactly. And the doubly hard is we had one reporter out there in the Atlantic provinces covering 4 provinces and hardly ever getting out to a place like Labrador, but she went out there and we supported that. We wanted people, her especially, to get out there as soon as possible. This story was a follow-up to an earlier story that was done by a friend of mine at CBC. She broke the story, and all of a sudden the media descended on this horrific story of northern abuse, of drug abuse, and it was kids, and something like 30 kids were taken out of their homes and sent off to treatment centers out in Alberta. I mean, that's half the country away. And nobody was talking about the impact on the community itself, the impact on the families that had.
Those left behind.
They were talking about, we're doing great for the kids by removing them out of this atmosphere, but they're going to go back.
Yeah.
And that's the story that Maureen was sent out to cover. Look at the follow-up. Look at the impact of it. Once the media left, so did all of the government attention. All of a sudden, the heat was off, and so was the support for doing anything. Let's send the kids off, and that's about it. And the story dropped off the table until Maureen went back up there again for APTN.
Okay, from the Atlantic to central BC, we go now for a story about pushback against resource development, not resource development, but luxury development, actually, against the wishes of the local Indigenous population. But this is also a story about RCMP surveillance and their interactions with journalists like APTN. Let's take a look.
The RCMP have returned APTN's videotapes. The tapes were confiscated from Envision correspondent Todd Lamarand on Sunday night. On the tapes, images of a weekend protest turned violent in British Columbia. Copies of the tapes were made. However, the RCMP have refused to return those copies. Supporters of the Native Youth Movement are also saying that the police used the tapes to make arrests. Envision's Rosanna Deerchild has more.
This is what started it all. Native activists marching through the Sun Peaks village near Kamloops, British Columbia. They are protesting the development of a ski resort on land they say is their traditional lands. The Native Youth Movement set up protest camps in early June, but it was last Sunday that it got violent. After taping this incident, Envision reporter Todd Lamarand was leaving when he says he was pulled over by the RCMP. His car and all its contents were impounded. They had no search warrant, nor was Lamarand charged with anything.
People, yes, it is. Normally, a court order is gotten after the tapes have gone to air. So this is most unusual that they would seize the tapes before they go to air.
APTN took legal action to have the tapes and all copies returned. The originals were returned today, but RCMP are refusing to return copies of the material. Kamloops RCMP spokesperson, Sergeant Randy Brown, would not say what they're using the tapes for.
Yeah, I don't know if they use that tape for that. I'm not privy to that information.
However, an NYM supporter says they were used to make arrests, and Arthur Manuel, chief of the Nesconleth band, says the tapes will be used during a court appearance of one of the demonstrators. Envision News Director Dan David says they will take further action to stop all use of the tapes. Rosanna Deerchild, Envision News.
So yet again, some very dramatic footage, obviously, and a very dramatic situation. I mean, that speaks to the sometimes difficult relationship between the media and policing services.
And again, another example of us sending cameras where nobody else went at first. It was covered by print reporters and by one or two radio stations, but really, we were the first television news camera crew to go there. And Todd Lamarand was new. He was based in Vancouver, and so he had to drive all the way out there and set his camera and try to get back to the station.
On his own, once again, just to emphasize that
just
it was
on
a
his
one-person
own.
crew. Yeah.
It was a one-person crew. And what that told me, too, was that the police at the time didn't think that we were legit, that we were too small to be bothered with, so they could do anything that they wanted to us.
Something they wouldn't dare do with CTV or CBC necessarily.
Global or anybody else, they wouldn't have dared, no. But with us, they could, and now that's why we pursued it. That's why we took them to court as soon as possible, not just to get our tapes back, but to teach them a lesson. You can't do that. You can't violate our journalistic rights. We're a news organization, and we stood up. I wish we had a bit more help from some of the other organizations like CBC and CTV, but we didn't really. I think the Canadian Association of Journalists sent a letter, but we were fighting that battle alone most times. And this wasn't the only example where that happened, but this is one of the most obvious and egregious.
Well, I mean, I think it's safe to say that maybe some of the other fellow media outlets, too, weren't taking us as seriously as I believe they do now. I think they're a lot more shoulder to shoulder with us on various aspects.
Yeah, things have changed. It's been a sea change. It's been amazing how much over the years, you know, you earn respect, and you earn it by standing up to organizations like the police, standing up for your rights. If we had folded, I don't think that we would have earned the respect of the other news organizations as quickly.
This might sound odd, though, in a way, but is that almost part of one of the rites of passage for a media outlet, is to push back and stand up against police like this? Because it seems police will go as far as they feel they can if they're not met with resistance in this regard.
I think it's with any journalist out there doing a story, not just a news organization, but any individual journalist to stand up for their rights. I think that you earn respect that way.
And two, I note that recent revelations have shown, recent behavior has shown that if anything, surveillance by the state, by state police outfits like the RCMP, among others, has only increased of Indigenous activism like the one we saw there at Sun Peaks.
But not so blatantly. You know, they're doing it secretly with wiretaps and by, you know, looking at your stuff online, taking your phone informations, but asking your neighbors about who you are and what you're trying to do. Did you travel to Greece last year for the riots? Those kinds of things. But taking our tapes anymore? No, I don't think so. I don't think that. I think they ask every now and then for material from journalists, but I don't think that they come in and actually arrest you like they did here. They entrapped him. They waited until Todd was out of cell phone range in this valley, and then they closed in on him and took him when he was completely helpless and out of touch.
Wow. All right, Dan, thanks for your perspective. We have to take a break. Keep your hands off that remote. There's still lots more reminiscing to come as our APTN News Retrospective continues. And welcome back to this special 20-year retrospective of APTN and APTN National News. I'm Rick Harp here with the first ever Director of News, Dan David. You're the guy who inflicted me on the world, you could say.
Yes, I'm
you
responsible.
Yeah,
I take the blame.
And you take full credit, full blame?
Yep.
Now, of course, Dan, as you know, there are times I'm trying to tell the story of some very big, very huge, very structural, overwhelming issues. It is sometimes best achieved by looking at it through the lens of one person, and I thought we'd show you just exactly one of those stories.
Welfare payments seem to get lower with each year. So what happens when the cost of living rises? And how does it affect the people who need it most? Envision's Cheryl McKenzie went out to find an answer.
Stan LeClaire holds a sign. I'm 60 years old. I don't get welfare. My caseworker cut me off. I sleep outside. Spare a few dollars for a blanket? People glance and quickly walk on, perhaps feeling as helpless as this man does to help himself. Stan says he used to work up in northern Manitoba building roads. Now he regularly makes his way down Portage Avenue, collecting aluminum cans for resale. A full cart gets $10. He says that because he supplements his income with cans, he was cut off of welfare. Stan says he has no choice but to sleep in the streets, eating out of a garbage can.
Does it bother you sometimes that you have to eat that? No?
Yeah, I have to. I'm hungry. I got no money.
Harold Dick volunteers as an advocate for people on welfare who feel they haven't been treated fairly. He works in a program called the Low Income Intermediary Project. Many of his clients have been cut off of welfare. It's a client list that grows by at least 4 people a day. More than half are Aboriginal, something he says is not a coincidence.
It's not a blatant racism, but I've seen it's very widespread, a very subtle racism, that pattern of behavior does seem to be a lot more intense towards Aboriginal people.
We called the provincial welfare office to ask if he had been cut off and why. We are not allowed access to his caseworker, but a communications officer said they would never cut somebody off for making a few dollars collecting cans. Harold says it's pretty common for people to be threatened that they'll be cut off of welfare. This usually happens, he says, when recipients don't meet the expectations their worker has set out for them. Expectations like getting a job or staying clean of alcohol and drugs.
All right, and that story of the can man was filed by APTN's Cheryl McKenzie, who's still with the news department. In fact, she's the latest you, Dan, you could say. And
Much better
you brought her on.
looking, too.
Much better looking? Oh, okay. Your thoughts about that story? As I say, it was an attempt to humanize what can be a very complex Byzantine issue that just, it's hard to get a grasp on, but except when you bring it down to earth, to the ground level.
Well, that's one of the things we tried to impress upon our reporters right from the start is try to get beyond the headlines. Don't be fascinated by the headlines like everybody else is. Try to get to the human side of the story. You know, get rid of the two-dimensional stereotypes. Start looking at real people in real ways. And this was one of those stories. We had, a couple of story ideas, and this one I remember really well, is because he used to pass right by him every day, and finally somebody said, why don't we do a story about him? And he's out there working his ass off every day, collecting those cans, trudging all the way down from here 2 or 3 miles away down to Polo Park to cash them in for a few cents so that he can live and get on to another day. Like, that's a hard-working man.
What's his story?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are lots of stories like that. Let's get beyond the headlines and the serious stuff and actually start filling out that who we are as people, and take a look at those more human stories that are so important to make us, like I say, get rid of the stereotypes, the easy stereotypes, and start filling out, putting flesh and bones on it. You know.
And in a way, you know, setting up the contrast between this human life, the struggle against a very dehumanizing bureaucracy.
And take a look at some of the other stories that we show where, you know, Maureen goes up there and she starts talking to people about, you know, the kids who are sniffing.
Yeah.
And what's their story? Why do they do it? Trying to find out. Again,
first person,
get past those easy things, you know, instead of just talking about people like objects, start trying to find out why they're doing what they're doing. That's what we're supposed to be doing as journalists.
All right, well, from the personal to the political we go now, and I have to confess this next clip is one of my faves, a moment I think really marked a turning point for us as a news operation. The year was 2000, the place was Ottawa, the occasion, the leadership vote for the Assembly of First Nations. And Dan, I recall this being a pretty big step for us in terms of, you know, editorially, technically, logistically. It was unprecedented, wouldn't you say?
I think when we threw the idea out that you're going to Ottawa and you're going to be covering this story live to air.
After the laughter subsided.
People were sweating because it had never been done before at, you know, a national Aboriginal news organization.
How many moving parts were there?
We had a crew of something like 20 people. We had a remote truck, satellite truck, based there at in Ottawa covering the conference. We had something like 15 people inside that van. We had another 15 or 20 people on the floor itself, including the two hosts. You were one of them.
Yes, I was, along with
3 reporters and I believe 4 camera people.
Yeah, I was co-hosting with Carol Adams, now Carol Morin, and you talked about bringing in these trucks. This was a new relationship we had forged with an outside crew as well. So that was a new stage for us. I mean, so much had to come together.
Exactly.
Man, and as you'll see, it comes together wonderfully in that kind of way that only live television can capture. So just to set the stage here for what you're about to see, Phil Fontaine is the incumbent national chief. His main challenger, Matthew Kuncombe. Now, at this point, we're awaiting a third ballot. Kuncombe was leading the pack, Fontaine in second, but under AFN rules, it takes 60% to win. And you won't believe what happened next.
We are going to be going to a third ballot, and the polls open up for that third ballot in the next half an hour. It will likely be at least another 3 hours before we know whether there is a new chief or an incumbent chief, or whether we're going to a fourth ballot.
And essentially the future course, political course of this particular representative body representing First Nations in Canada. I understand Ken Williams has more information to share with us from the floor.
Ken?
Ken?
Well, it was not much more. But what I was thinking is that the other thing is that with the vote being so close like that, I mean, not so close, but the fact that Fontaine there's something going on here now. I was about to say that Phil might just throw in the towel since he's that close, and he just might be doing that now. I don't know who's down there.
We've got a little storm going on here. Our camp is trying to get in close.
I think it's probably
Matthew Kuncombe's camp, as you can see by the banner up there.
No, I'm not.
I think that's Maureen down there. I'm not sure if she can get a sense of what's going on in the huddled mass there.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea just to watch and try and figure out what is happening at the moment.
Well, we'll await word from Maureen in case anything specific comes up there.
Okay, I'm going to just try to stick my mic in there.
Okay, we're going to let our correspondents run around and try and get frantic here. It's nuts.
Okay, we did have David Moses. What is this?
Okay, we're right in the midst of things here on the floor, and I can tell you what has happened is that Phil Fontaine has conceded. He's walked across the floor to the Matthew Kuncom, and that means that we will not be going to a third ballot. It means that Matthew has won this race, and that's so if we can just get a possible shot over here, I'll try and get in here and see if we can talk to them. Alrighty, we're going to try and work our way in here.
Phil Fontaine is on the podium.
Matthew is very close to the back of the wall. He is talking with other chiefs. Okay, we're going to go to Phil on the podium, definitely.
Chiefs, elders, delegates, my friends, I first of all want to congratulate our new national chief, Matthew Kuncom.
Wow, it was like yesterday. I get goosebumps watching that.
Yeah, the hair on the back of my neck went up. It's amazing. It was one of those things. You just throw people out there and hope like hell that it works, and it did. Because everybody over the weeks before that were training and training and training. But it was just the idea of having a live special around an election. You didn't know how it was going to start or how it was going to end. But it's just the adventure and the excitement was palpable. I mean, in the shots that you saw there, and the voices.
But there's no preparing for that, too.
No.
That's what made it all the more exhilarating.
And people acted like professionals.
Yeah. Now, some say AFN elections after that are a little less chaotic, a little less unpredictable.
More staged.
More staged, yeah.
For you guys.
Is that our fault?
Yes. It is, unfortunately, it is.
Or we certainly, yeah.
Because they used to kick reporters out, you remember. And when they kicked out CBC or CTV, the rest of us went as well. But we were print. Now, with you guys, I mean, they can't tell their people in the communities, no reporters allowed, no cameras allowed, because guess what? You're talking directly to their constituents.
Right, yeah. Man, I love seeing Ken, the guy who kind of looks like Trotsky there. He's talking, and I was like, oh, I think there's something happening. I was just, yeah, you can't replicate that. All right, so our last story, a little lower key, is about a couple of lads you sadly don't see around Broken Head First Nation anymore. Both have since passed, but years ago, anyone using the highway that cut through Broken Head would always be sure to see this dynamic duo in action.
Life one day at a time has a whole new meaning for two brothers from the Broken Head Reserve in Manitoba. Henry and Nelson Starr have a routine that passers-by have come to rely on. They are mentally challenged. However, their big hearts and their unique brand of hospitality have earned them the rank of ambassador. Envision's Todd Lamarand explains.
I like waving at them and they wave back.
Several days a week, Henry and Nelson Starr, accompanied by their dog Pooh Bear, journey down to a worn patch of ground by the highway. For hours on end, they stand and wave a warm hello to passing motorists.
I guess it's good PR for Broken Head. People really talk about it everywhere we go. We seem to hear about them standing there, and people, as soon as we mention that we're from Broken Head, they right away ask about, hey, what are those two guys in the ditch doing? They're waving. So they're great. I mean, it keeps putting us on a map, so to speak.
I think that's really great. I think whenever I see them, I feel good that greeting people on the highway.
That's nice. They're just waving at cars and they're going by. Most people honk.
The people like it a lot.
Nelson and Henry used to walk along the highway when passing motorists began honking. They began waving back. Both brothers plan to greet people for as long as they can. Plus, the job has its fringe benefits.
There's girls who come here and give me drinks. Yeah, there's three of them come down that road there.
I can kiss you too.
Todd Lamrand, Envision News, Broken Head First Nation, Manitoba.
Yeah, I'm seeing those guys. You were really smiling a lot during that piece.
Yeah, it's one of those stories that really, we need to hear. It's not just like the new rules for journalism, it gets beyond the, drugs, drunks, death, and destruction.
Maybe dancing once in a while, yeah.
Every now and then, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a human type story, and it's the kind of thing that makes you want to smile, because it does say something about our humanity.
Yeah, and it's an interesting contrast with the story we just saw. Just thousands of people, chaos, and then now we're in a ditch, a couple of guys just enjoying the day and trying to add a little joy to other people's lives as they drive by.
It talks about how news has evolved. I mean, before that, it would have been, all that serious stuff, and it would have been, not really great stories. It would have been about tragedy as opposed to, a human story. I call them stupid hat stories, basically, because they say so much about who we are as people.
Okay.
And not just, tragic statistics.
Now, Dan, you recently told me that APTN was always this weird, distant dream until it wasn't. And even when we did launch, the naysayers out there told us, well, how long are you going to last? Despite getting past the first hurdle, they were right there to talk about, ready to tell us we're not going to succeed, we're not going to endure. And it's 20 years in, and literally a generation. You're going to share a letter with us in about 35 seconds, but I want you to just channel that idea that it's been a generation of Indigenous television.
I mean, just hearing the voices of Greg Taylor, Maureen Gugu, and other people, the whole idea was to take a whole bunch of people who had never worked in television before, train them, get them out there, and then maybe inflict them on the industry like a virus, and start spreading around, so that, that generational thing, that we evolve when we begin to infect the news industry in general. I think it's a great idea. I think it's working too.
Yeah. So you were obviously, as the first ever news director, a big part of getting this first generation off the ground. And so to help close off this look back, we talked about it, and you wanted to share some of an open letter that you wrote shortly after the very first newscast went to air on APTN. So why don't we get you to look at the camera and...
signed by everybody.
Look at that, yeah, right.
Including Jim Compton, who is Director of Programming, our noble leaders, our various directors, but everybody, sound, camera, reporters, everybody. And this is what I wrote at the time. There aren't many times in a person's life that one gets a chance to be on the ground floor of something new and even revolutionary. This whole Aboriginal television network is new, so are the programs we're producing, such as the movie show Contact and Vision. Too often, it's easy to forget just how groundbreaking everything truly is in building this new network and its programs. Everything we do breaks old stereotypes, shatters outdated attitudes, gives hope to people who have lived without hope for far too long. It's easy to forget that just a few short months ago, this building was full of dust and the sound of drills and saws. Perhaps we shouldn't be doing any of the things we were doing today with equipment that were still being installed, software not quite working, offices still being built. But we are. Today our building is alive with people doing what many thought inconceivable or even impossible for Aboriginal peoples. We're producing top-notch national programs and putting them on the air day after day after day. When things don't work, we improvise. When we can't improvise, we find help from friends outside. When nothing seems to go our way, we still manage to get the job done. Mostly without complaint at the long hours.
Mostly.
Usually with humor and a sense of common purpose.
Oh my God, that's perfect.
Everyone pulls together to overcome the inevitable challenges which every news station and network goes through, and strangely enough, seems to bring out the best in everyone. Failure, it seems, is not an option for any of you, and the stakes were so high. If we knew that if we failed, If we failed, we wouldn't be failing just for us. We wouldn't be failing a network, a corporation, a company. We would be failing all Indigenous peoples, and not just for now, but for generations to come. So we had to succeed.
Oh, no pressure.
No pressure. But
Well,
that's the unsaid thing.
Yeah.
And that's what people lived up to. They took the challenge and they did it.
Dan David, I want to thank you for going down on this trip of memory lane. And thank you for watching us here on the program. We've enjoyed having you. And yeah, take a moment to celebrate all we've accomplished here. 20 years, folks. Holy smokes. I'm feeling it. But we want to thank you for joining us. And have a good evening. Take care. I'm Rick Harp with Dan David.
Thank you.